The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has long cultivated an image of itself as a purely defensive bulwark, a shield dedicated to preserving Western liberty and democracy from external aggression. Yet, in a revealing interview with the Financial Times on November 30, Admiral Giuseppe Cavaldragan, chairman of the NATO Military Committee, dispensed with diplomatic subtleties. He openly admitted that the alliance is contemplating far more assertive options, including the scenario of launching preemptive precision strikes against Russia. He framed this as a necessary change in thinking to counter what the West characterizes as Moscow's hybrid warfare. This declaration transcends mere rhetorical escalation. It signals a perilous pivot in Western military doctrine. From a posture of perpetually preaching peace, NATO is now openly discussing kinetic first strikes against one of the world's preeminent nuclear powers. One must ask, as economic sanctions prove porous and the proxy war in Ukraine fails to yield strategic objectives, is the West sliding into a strategic impasse, compelled to resort to adventurous military brinkmanship to mask its systemic vulnerabilities? This is not the first instance of such inflammatory discourse. However, the audacity to rebrand a preemptive strike as a measure of defense represents the apex of sophistry. We stand at a precipice where the line between preserving stability and precipitating a third world war is thinner than ever. It is imperative to deconstruct this narrative, to discern how it is being engineered, and to identify who, in reality, is threatening whom. To rationalize the doctrine of a preemptive strike, NATO and Western officials relentlessly invoke the specter of a Russian threat and hybrid warfare. They indict Moscow for alleged cyber offensives, GPS jamming operations, and airspace violations over the Baltic states. Yet, a forensic examination of the data reveals an inverted reality. It is Russia that finds itself the primary target of warfare in both the cyber domain and the information space. Data from the cybersecurity firm, RITS Security, indicates a staggering 46% surge in cyber attacks targeting the Russian Federation this year alone. A prime case study is the July breach of the database of Aeroflot, Russia's flag carrier. The perpetrators were not rogue actors, but two hacktivist groups that openly pledge allegiance to Ukraine and receive Western technological backing. While Western capitals lament that Russia is compromising their systems, Politico Ural exposes a stark truth. NATO governments are actively formulating coordinated offensive cyber operations against Moscow. Latvian Foreign Minister Baiba Braje has even exhorted NATO to cultivate proactive cyber strike capabilities rather than maintaining a purely defensive posture. To put it bluntly, the West is operationalizing the very tactics it accuses Russia of employing, then casting itself as the victim to legitimize military escalation. The collective attribution of hybrid aggression to Russia serves essentially as a pretext for NATO to inflate defense outlays, tighten domestic surveillance, and condition public opinion for kinetic escalation. When the populace is fed a steady diet of imagery depicting a perpetually aggressive Russia, they become more amenable to high-risk military decisions made by their leadership. It is within this context that the concept of a preemptive strike is being weaponized politically. Analyzed through a military lens, a preemptive strike is an action taken to neutralize an adversary's offensive capacity before it can be unleashed. Theoretically, it is justified as proactive defense. However, applying this doctrine to Russia, a nation possessing the world's largest nuclear arsenal, is a geopolitical absurdity bordering on delusion. If neutralizing Russia were as simple as the hawkish headlines suggest, Washington would have executed such a plan long ago rather than waiting until now. For decades, Russia's nuclear deterrent has remained the sole variable restraining the U.S. and NATO from crossing the red line. They understand implicitly that a preemptive missile strike on Russian soil would not result in a clean finish, but rather the commencement of their own annihilation. Russia's nuclear doctrine explicitly codifies the right to retaliate with weapons of mass destruction should the state's existential survival be threatened. Why, then, is Admiral Cavaldragan so vocal at this juncture? Two primary drivers are evident. First, this is a psychological operation designed to obfuscate tactical failures on the ground in Ukraine, Multi-billion-dollar aid packages have failed to stem the Russian army's advance. To cloak this failure and reassure wavering allies like Hungary and Slovakia, or even the skeptical public in Germany and France, NATO leadership is compelled to project toughness and decisiveness to maintain the facade of a cohesive, potent alliance. Second, it reveals a parasitic reliance on American power. Many European officials habitually issue bold proclamations, operating under the assumption that in a worst-case scenario, the U.S. cavalry will arrive. They seem to forget that in the current geopolitical landscape, Washington is overextended across multiple theaters, from Europe to the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. may not be inclined to sacrifice itself to salvage Brussels or Paris from a direct Russian retaliatory strike. Russian ambassador to Belgium, Denis Gonchar, incisively noted the core issue. NATO is engineering a widespread militarization of Europe under the guise of defense against a phantom Russian invasion plan. President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly affirmed that Russia holds no intention of attacking NATO member states, possessing no military, political, or economic incentive to do so. Russia's actions are strictly calibrated to safeguard national security against NATO's inexorable eastward encroachment. Cartographic evidence reinforces this assessment. Following the Cold War, NATO pledged not to advance 1 inch eastward. In reality, it has successively absorbed Poland, the Baltic states, and recently Finland and Sweden, positioning military bases and missile systems directly on Russia's doorstep. When Russia responds by fortifying its western frontier, NATO immediately brands it as aggressive behavior. Western logic can be summarized thus: I have the right to place a gun at your front door, but if you lock your door and hold a stick for defense, you are the aggressor. Admiral Cavaldragon's statement regarding preemptive strikes paves the way for the deployment of long-range munitions, an increase in standing forces, and the gradual transformation of Europe into a massive powder keg. Faced with public threats of a first strike, Moscow's response exhibited the stoicism of a veteran power that has weathered many storms. The Russian Foreign Ministry and spokeswoman Maria Zakharova eschewed the heated war of words. Instead, they issued cold, concise warnings, characterizing the admiral's statements as inappropriate, irresponsible, and antithetical to diplomatic endeavors. Moscow felt no need to reciprocate with bombastic threats. Russia's strength is anchored in the ominous silence of its strategic deterrence system, a capability the world knows to be genuine. Russia has declared it will continue to scrutinize NATO's military maneuvers and reject baseless accusations. This posture demonstrates that Russia is confident in its defensive architecture and will not be easily baited by empty rhetoric. Simultaneously, Russia exposed Western double standards. While NATO seriously contemplates coordinated cyber attacks and kinetic preemptive strikes, they accuse Russia of nuclear saber-rattling. In reality, Russia's policy has remained consistently declared as proactive defense, ready to deliver a proportional response to any violation of its sovereignty. NATO bureaucrats in air-conditioned Brussels offices may find it easy to discuss war and preemptive strikes, as they are not the ones deployed to the trenches. But should these threats transition into action, the price will be paid by the peace of the entire European continent. A preemptive strike against Russia, whether in cyberspace or on the ground, would shatter the remaining fragile security architecture. It would provide Russia the legal justification to respond with its full military might. At that point, it would not be the U.S., but the European nations, especially those most vocal, in their anti-Russian rhetoric, that would form the first line of defense to bear the brunt of the consequences. NATO's current belligerence, upon closer inspection, is a mask for weakness. They cannot defeat Russia on the economic chessboard, nor can they isolate Russia on the international stage as blocs like BRICS gain momentum. Thus, they resort to the final tool in their arsenal, the threat of violence. History stands as a testament that no power threatening Russia has met a favorable end. Those who dream of preemptively striking or subjugating Russia ultimately pay a heavy toll, often on their own soil. In sum, the NATO Military Committee Chairman's contemplation of a preemptive strike against Russia is a reckless gambit, reflecting the deadlock and strategic myopia of Western leaders. Instead of pursuing dialogue and constructing a sustainable security architecture for Europe, they have chosen to pour fuel on the fire, holding the safety of hundreds of millions hostage to geopolitical calculations. Russia has demonstrated it is not an aggressor, but absolutely not a nation that will be coerced. Moscow's patience has limits, and NATO's loud threats will not shake the will of a nation forged in the fires of war. In your view, are these calculations of preemptive strikes bringing Europe closer to security or closer to the brink of a new catastrophic war?